this computer. Okay. All right. So we are going to get started. Looks like everybody can hear me. We've already checked. I can hear you, so that's great. We have a lot to talk about. I know 2.5 hours is a lot of time, but we're covering a lot of material. I'm going to do my best. I have my timer in front of me because I know everyone has had a long day. So I'm going to try to do my best after we cover just some housekeeping things, some announcements, try to keep each chapter, right, 6, 7, and 8 to around 15 to 20 minutes. So we'll work on a break at some point, kind of about halfway through. We'll take 5-minute break, or maybe I'll take another poll to see where everyone's at, depending, each day is a little bit different as far as what you've had on your plate. So we need to take a longer break. We can kind of take a class poll and see where we're at from that regard. So the first thing I want to do is, I know this is always of importance to students, so I wanted to just cover some announcements and then talk just briefly about the exam, see if you have any questions and kind of run down any issues you might have had. So let me share my screen so I make sure that I hit everything that I want to hit tonight on that. Let's see here. Technology is not my friend today. Okay. All right. Okay, so here's some announcements, right? So the quizzes for chapters 9 and 10 will be posted tomorrow. Just complete those quizzes by Tuesday by 11:59 p.m. So same game plan. Obviously, we took the week off for the exam on the quizzes last week. Discussion board assignment number 1 will be posted tomorrow. Your first post, I normally have them set for like Saturday, Monday, but I'm going to kick it out an extra day. I'll probably do that just because we meet on Wednesday, gives you an extra day. Especially I know having a Saturday assignment is kind of a pain, even though you have a couple days before then. So your first post is going to be due by 11:59 on Sunday evening, and then a response to a classmate is going to be due by Tuesday at 11:59. So this is going to be, so you've already done the introduction assignment. This is going to be based on the content that we're covering in class, right? So you'll have a question. These are much more straightforward. A 300-word response to my question, and then a 300-word response to a classmate. So I'll just remind you, because I get students to ask, if you see somebody, a classmate that's posted something you want to respond to on tomorrow or Friday or Saturday, Sunday, you can absolutely respond as soon as you want to, right? You don't have to wait until Monday morning to start responding. You can respond to somebody. If they post, you can get your assignment done and absolutely be done with it. So, all right, Civil Liberties political cartoon is due by October 2nd. I will have all the parameters. The parameters are in the syllabus, but I will also post them clearly on Blackboard, but we're also going to talk about it tonight so I can answer any questions. All right, and then exam 1. Any questions, any overarching questions, concerns about exam 1? Technical problems? I didn't hear from anybody. Anything anybody would like to share? Anything that threw them off? All right. So a couple of things about the exam. Hopefully you got a feel for what the exams are like, right? They're not set out to trick you. The exam's pretty, we want to make sure, I want to make sure that you're understanding the material. But like I said, we don't have the flexibility to dive really deep into all these topics. So, it's terms, concepts, and connecting those concepts like you did in your apply the knowledge assignment and things like that. So pretty basic. For the most part, everybody did a nice job. Some obviously did better than others, but that's just how it goes. I will tell you, I have a few students that had in this class that had some emergencies, so we're setting up times for them to take the exam. The reason I tell you that is because after that exam is done, I go through and I look at the questions. Okay? If there seems to be themes where the same question is being missed by multiple students and there's kind of a trend, I make note of that and I curve the scores accordingly. Okay, so everybody will get their grades curved up. It just depends by how much, like how many questions there were. Typically on average, grades on exams, especially the first exam, gets curved about 10 to 12 points. Okay, so just based on the questions. And that doesn't mean the questions are necessarily bad questions. I don't, I work hard on ensuring that the questions I ask are about topics that we've talked about in depth, but sometimes maybe there is just some confusion, whatever it is. So we'll see how this shakes out here and what the trends are on some of these questions. But so if you're concerned at all about your grade, you'll get a little bump afterwards. Okay. And then this, like I said, just gives you a taste for what exams 2 and 3 are going to be. Exam 3 is the final exam, and there'll probably be a short answer or two on the final exam. But other than that, exam 2 and most of exam 3 are multiple choice. Make sense? Okay, pretty straightforward. But like I said, very nice job. If you want to talk to me offline, send me an email, say, hey, look, I saw this question, review it. If you saw this question and say, hey, look, I didn't think this question was fair, or I need some clarification on this so that I understand. Just reach out and we can go through it. Okay. All right. With that, I'm going to exit out of here. I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to share. All right, just a few slides because it's good to show some examples. All right, so the reason I go over this, the political cartoon, the civil liberties political cartoon assignment, the reason I assign this is because there's so much confusion around civil liberties and civil rights, right? What are the differences? Not necessarily in this class, but just in general, especially when we conflate the two, liberties and rights, we use them interchangeably. It's really important to make sure we understand. So this assignment is geared towards kind of a fun assignment to go out, see what political cartoons are out there. I mean, political cartoons have been around for centuries, right? Political cartoons are nothing new. Political cartoons are still a great way in a short time frame to get a point across, right? We've seen cartoons that are simple, political cartoons that are more in depth, so they can be a little bit more complicated, but political cartoons are used all the time, and they're a great way to convey a message about contemporary political issues. And that's what they're about. They want to convey something going on in our society, in our culture today. Okay. So it's important for me to go through a few examples and talk through, make sure you don't have any questions, because I have every class, I've had students that knock it out of the park and then kind of fail miserably. And when they fail miserably, it's not based on their write-up or their understanding of the cartoon. It's based on their ability to identify a cartoon that addresses a civil liberty. A lot of times they'll choose a cartoon that's just a generic political cartoon that doesn't address civil liberties, and they've kind of completely missed the point. Or they choose a political cartoon that's deals with civil rights. And of course, that won't get you any points either, because guess what? That's not the assignment. So remember, right? When I say civil liberties, what am I talking about? Who can share with the class? Who can remind us all when we talk civil liberties? What are we talking about? Benjamin, go ahead.
Freedoms that the government cannot infringe on.
Absolutely. That's what we're talking about. God-given, or however you want to look at it, God-given or natural rights that you're born with, that you have these freedoms. Being an individual, being a human being, the government cannot take them away from you. They cannot infringe on them. Okay, so where do we typically see, where would we look if we wanted to identify civil liberties? Where would we typically look in the Constitution?
Bill of
Anybody?
Rights.
The Bill of Rights, right? And I know that gets confusing because it's called the Bill of Rights, right? But remember, when you think Bill of Rights, think Bill of Limits. Bill of
Or Bill of
Limits,
Liberties.
civil liberties. Yeah, exactly right. Bill of Limits, civil liberties, exactly right. So here we go. So I want to just talk through a couple examples because this is some basic, this is where I see students get tripped up, and I want to make sure you don't do that. So here's kind of here's the outline here. And I've kind of talked about that, right? Conversations about civil liberties occur often in our society, in the courts, the classroom, the dinner table, right? Political cartoons address these civil liberties issues, okay? So I want you to choose a recent political cartoon relating to civil liberties. And when I say recent, I mean 2014 and later, right? So 2014 up to the present day. You're going to identify and explain the cartoonist's point of view, the symbols in the cartoon, and any relevant court decision, lawsuit, legislation that prompted the cartoon and its significance, right? We talk about cartoons address contemporary political and social issues, right? So they're typically, if you saw a cartoon that was posted last week, you're going to probably know exactly what it's talking about because we've heard about an issue on the news, whatever the case might be. You're going to identify, and then you're going to talk about whether you agree with the perspective of the cartoonist and why or why not. It's going to be, right, you got a couple weeks to do it, a little over 2 weeks. It's not anything that's overwhelming. 2 to 3 pages, double space, not more than 3 pages. Practice being concise, being direct, to the point. Some of your cartoons might be more simple than others, so they're naturally going to be a little bit shorter. Some are more complex. It's going to lend itself to being a little bit longer, but focus on being clear and concise about all of those different components of the assignment. You must provide the image and the correct citation for the image. That includes the artist and the date of publication. I'm sorry, this I don't know why I had this. It's October 2nd. I'll correct that. I'll make sure I send out an email to correct that. I know I had like no October 9th on the brain when I wrote that. But so here's something, just note, right? We're not going to know every issue that a cartoonist might be addressing, so you might have to do a little research to be able to fully explain and understand the relevant event and its significance. Okay, so which honestly, I will tell you, each and every one of you, I'm very impressed with the amount of research you're willing to do, even just for the introduction discussion assignment. The research was strong, so I have no doubt that you'll be able to research the issue. So that's just an extra kudos to you guys. Well done on the research. Really enjoyed it. Oh, and on the apply the knowledge assignment as well. Just so you understand research. For the most part, folks know how to cite. If you have questions about citations, you don't have to necessarily cite in this outside of the cartoon. You don't necessarily have to cite, but just moving forward, just reference the syllabus. There's resources for citations. All right, so here we go. Here's a cartoon. Here's an example, right? Is this a civil liberties issue or civil rights issue? Who wants to chime in? What do you think? Who wants to be brave? Good, take a shot. We'll talk through it. Let me see if I can get the chat. If anybody's posting in the chat. Whoop. I can't pull up the chat here. There it is. Nobody in the chat yet. Come on, who wants to? I'm not going to let you off easy. Who wants to take a shot? We just covered these chapters. So civil liberties or civil right?
Is this
When we
a civil right?
And why did you say? Why do you think civil rights?
I'm pretty sure. I think it's the Fourth Amendment that protects the right of privacy.
Okay, so when we think, so you think Bill of Rights. Now, where are you thinking? So where should our head go if we're pointing to? And you're absolutely right, talking about right unreasonable search and seizure.
Yeah.
Right, surveillance, and we can point, which you
When I
correctly
think of
said.
Fourth Amendment, I
point to
think
the-
of Matt versus Ohio. First case I think of.
Hold on one second. So, and that was Sebastian, right? So Sebastian, so if you can point to, let's say, the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah.
Where should your mind go? Civil in the Bill of Rights. Should you think civil liberties or civil rights?
Well, civil liberties, because that's what the government can't do, basically.
Right, exactly right. So and I know it gets confusing when you talk about, like I said, Bill of Rights, right? But think limits, liberties, right? Bill of limits means civil liberties, right?
Yeah.
So appreciate you going out on a limb there. I'm glad you correctly identified the issue and the particular liberty in the Bill of Rights that we're talking about. So that's great,
Yep.
right? So think about those things, right? Is this talking about something in the Bill of Limits, right? In the Bill of Rights? And if so, what is it, right? Is it about unreasonable search and seizure? Is it about privacy? Is it about the First Amendment? Is it about the Second Amendment, right? What is it about? And if you can find it, if you're tying it back to the Bill of Rights, then you've got a good cartoon 99 times out of 100. That's not always the case, and I'm going to throw a tricky one at you here in a second, okay? But 99 times out of 100, if you're talking about an issue that ties back to the Bill of Rights, you're in good shape, okay? All right, very good job. All right, how about this? All right, what's going on in this cartoon, right? Civil liberties.
That's a civil right.
This is civil rights. Why? This deals with civil rights. Why?
This is the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, segregation.
Right. So this is about, right? This is about segregation, right? So has the nice imagery there in the public school. You see, right, that Dixie representing the South, the kids crying in the window, that segregation's getting kicked out of public school. You know, you see the Supreme Court written on the arm there, that's removing segregation, right? All this symbolism, right? And right away, right, we knew what this was about, right? But this is about what government must do to provide equal access to education for everybody. So civil liberties, what government can't do; civil rights, what government must do to treat everyone fairly.
And
Make
that
sure
right
everyone's
there is
treated
Brown
fairly.
versus Board of Education.
Right, Brown v. Board, absolutely. So well done there. So good job. So you get it, right? So is this about equal treatment of citizens? Then you're off track. If you can tie it back to the Bill of Rights, then you're in good shape, right? All right, how about this one? Civil liberty, civil rights.
Second Amendment, civil liberty.
Okay, is it? Is this about the Second Amendment? I'm not picking on you. I'm asking because this is important. This is where I bring up a cartoon like this is because this is where a lot of my students get in trouble. They get hung up.
This is confusing.
I am confused as well.
So what are you confused about? What I said? Are you confused at what I said? Or the cartoon itself?
I'm confused on what the cartoon is trying to portray.
Okay, so let's look at it, right? So let's look at the symbolism. What's the guy in the red, white, and blue? Who is that?
Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam, right? The US government, okay? Then you have an individual reading a newspaper saying another mass shooting, right? Okay, so, and then underneath it says the very definition of a mental health issue, because so it could be addressing mass shooters and mental illness, but it's saying, look, the fact that, right, we're not addressing this, right? The fact that we're going to keep doing, well, she's saying, or he's saying, whatever it is, what we're doing isn't working, and Uncle Sam says, so we'll keep doing it until it does, right? Right? We've all heard that quote, right? What's the definition of insanity? Right? Doing something, the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Right? So, right, they're talking about it being a mental health issue, right? So what we're doing isn't working, and that could be related to mental health. It could be related to crime prevention or a variety of different things. Now, just because we're talking about guns, and this is the point I want to make to you, and that's kind of where the trick comes in. Just because we're talking about guns doesn't make it a Second Amendment issue. Okay, you can talk about mass shootings, gang violence, increases in crime, and you could be, the cartoonist could be talking about, right, the police. Are they effective? What's going on, right? Are the police doing their job? Are legislators doing their job, right? What's going on with gun violence, right? So it's not necessarily. Now, if the cartoonist is talking about too much gun violence, and maybe there's a picture of Uncle Sam that says, don't worry, I'll take care of it, right? We can regulate the Second Amendment. Does that become a Second Amendment issue? Absolutely, right? So if they're talking about regulating guns, right, then it becomes a Second Amendment issue. But if they're just talking about mass shootings or gun violence or increases in crime in general, then you have to be careful that, number one, that you might want to choose a different cartoon, or number two, you have to be very creative or very effective in making that connection to the Second Amendment, right? And if the cartoonist doesn't do that directly, you kind of have a hard time kind of finding these, what's implied there. Is there something else implied? You're kind of interpreting it maybe beyond how it was meant to be interpreted, okay? Does that make sense? Thumbs up or an A-okay? I hope that makes sense, right? Okay, all right. Last one, civil liberty. What do you think? Now you're all a little gun shy maybe now. Addressing a civil liberty. All right, so what's in there, right? So we talk about, right, we're talking, see Obama on the belt with pens, executive orders, right? Using the power of the pen, the president's power to issue executive orders, and then, right, what's there on the fence post, right? The bullseye with the Second Amendment, right? And so what's the cartoonist trying to convey here?
Is it Obama trying to sign to remove the Second Amendment, I'm guessing, and then that would be a civil right issue.
Civil right or civil liberty?
Because of the government. Because the Second Amendment's a fundamental right.
Right. So that means the government, does that mean the government must do something or can't do something?
Cannot. So it's a liberty situation.
You got it, right? Yeah. So ask those questions, go through this process, right? There's no shame in going through this mental process, right? Is it something government can't do or must do, right? think about the bill of limits, right? What we're tying back, but you're absolutely right, right? So this is important to talk through, and I can talk through if you want to share with me a cartoon, and we can talk through it the same way once you find one. But that you're exactly right, Sebastian is right. We're talking about using the executive order to restrict Second Amendment freedom. Okay, and that's what the cartoonist is saying here. Yeah. All right, so just wanted to share a couple examples. I don't want to belabor this too much because we have to get to other topics here. As I said, we have a lot to cover, but any general questions about that? It'll be up. Like I said, you can look at the syllabus, but this will be up tomorrow. So, and then reach out. You say, hey, is this a cartoon that makes sense? And then just be ready for when you reach out to me, if you reach out to me, just make sure you understand the cartoon, because I won't just say yes or no. I'll ask you those kind of questions, right? Does it say what the government can't do? Or does it address something the government must do? Or does it do neither? If it's just a generic political cartoon that's addressing some current event, right, it might not be either. All right, so make sure you understand the cartoon. And if I ask you any questions about it, you make sure you might not have all the answers, but at least you have a basic fundamental understanding of the cartoon, and then we can kind of talk through it, okay? All right, well done. Like I said, it gets confusing. This is why, so you can imagine, this is why I do the assignment. I think it's fun, right? It gets you an opportunity to kind of look at contemporary events, how cartoonists are conveying that, the different sides of the issue, and then you get to talk a little bit about whether or not you agree with it or not. Right, and that's fun, right? Because we get to kind of share a little bit of our, we get to use our critical thinking skills. We get to try to persuade, right? This is why I don't agree with the cartoonist, and this is why, and try to make your case. Because to me, like I said, I've said from the beginning, right? I don't care what you think. I care that you think, right? Your ideology is of no consequence to me, right? I want you to be able to support your decision, your positions, and make your case, okay? All right, so let me share, we'll go back to, all right, so here we go. All right, so we'll buckle down, right? We're gonna go right into chapter 6, right? So we've gone through kind of the institutional, right? The founding institutional framework components of our system of government, right? We talk about the founding. We talk about foundational principles. We talk about the Constitution and how the Constitution came about. Again, really nice job on the apply your knowledge assignment, right? Understanding, right? A well-rounded discussion about these different proposals, why they were important, right? How they affect us today, right? We're bringing all of these discussions to current day, right? And you guys did a nice job of saying how do these things impact? So these kind of structural foundational chapters. Now we're getting into the political players, right? Now we're going to talk in the last unit about the institutions themselves, right? The president, Congress, the bureaucracy, the judiciary. Those are important, right? So we'll talk about those institutions, right? We're talking about government structural development and foundational principles, governing documents. Now we're getting into the political players. Who are all these? Now we've set up the rules of the game, right? Right, that's what we're talking about. Now, here are the rules of the game. Now let's talk about all the players, right? And how they have to work within the system. That's what we're talking. Remember, politics and government, right? We've set up the government, we've set up the rules of the game. Now let's send some players out on the field and see what happens, right? Because there's a lot of things that we discuss every day, the courts deal with, Congress deals with, the states deal with. So how do these players go about? So we're going to talk about public opinion, right? Because when we're talking about public opinion, which players are we talking about? Come on now. Which players are we talking about in this game? Public opinion, not a trick question. I'm telling you, political scientists aren't that creative. right? Public opinion. Who are we talking about? Who are the players when we're talking about public opinion?
The people.
Us, right? That's what we're talking about, right? Public opinion is, let me open up this chat. Yep, there you go. Sebastian, Bree got it, right? Thanks for chiming in there, Bree and Sebastian, right? The people, us, right? That's what we're talking about, right? And we're going to talk about the impact, right? So we can talk about public opinion polls, and we're going to do that tonight. So what? It's a bunch of people stating their opinion. Great. What does that matter? Well, we're going to talk about why that matters in this process. And that's what we need to keep in mind. It's you, especially when you think you're not being heard, or your representatives in Congress or the county, local level, state level don't hear you, right? It's not necessarily you that they're not listening to. It's they're following and they're paying attention to public opinion, right? So we're going to define public opinion and talk about public opinion and policymaking, okay? So what is public opinion? If you were to kind of try to give me an idea of what public opinion is, what do you think it is? Is it your opinion and my opinion and everybody in this class's opinion and our family opinion, right? Everyone has an opinion, right? Well, who's right? Everyone in the public, every citizen, every individual has an opinion, right? That's public opinion. Is that public opinion? No, it's not public opinion. It's the aggregate, right, of all of those opinions coming together to provide information, okay? So the aggregate of individual attitudes or beliefs shared by some portion of the adult population, right? So you see these numbers, right? We've seen them, right? 55% of the country, I'm just throwing these numbers out, it agrees that marijuana, some form of marijuana use should be legal, okay? It could be, I'm guessing it's maybe higher than that, I don't know, but so that's a public opinion. That's not saying, oh, Johnny says this and Susie says this and all these individuals. No, it's coming together, right, in a scientific process, right, a systematic process to gather those opinions, right, those individual attitudes, and bring them all together to decide kind of how the public, right, in the aggregate feels about issues, right? So what's a consensus issue? Do you hear consensus? What do you think?
The average.
Can be average, right? I get what you're saying this, but when we think about a kind of a category of public opinion, when we think consensus, we're thinking there's a large significant agreement, like a kind of a super majority agreement about a particular issue, right? So general agreement among citizens on an issue, right? So you're getting into like 60, 65, 70%, if not more, agree that we need to support members in the military. Okay, right? That's, that's consensus, right? A large portion of those polled agree that that's important, okay? Divisive opinion is that opinion, that's where we typically see, right? Especially on those cultural issues, abortion, the Second Amendment, right? Gun control, these things, right? Or these are opinions where there's polarized between two quite different positions. And it's not necessarily 50-50, but it's usually pretty close, okay? And then a non-opinion, right? What's a non-opinion? And say, why do we care? We'll talk about why non-opinions are important, right? Who cares, right? What are non-opinions? Right? Non-opinions are, somebody has no opinion, right? Like again, political scientists and pollsters not necessarily all that creative with their labeling. Non-opinion, right? You have a lack of opinion on an issue or policy among the majority, right? You don't care, right? Does anybody have an opinion about abortion? Probably, right? Do you have opinion about the, mating habits of Canadian geese, right? I mean, probably not.
100%.
Maybe you do. But I mean, the chances of you caring about that and being able to form and have an informed decision, right? Probably not going to happen. So we have divisive opinions and consensus opinions on things that tend to matter, but then we can see where non-opinions shake out on things that we don't know enough about or don't care about. Okay. All right. So sometimes a poll shows a distribution of opinion indicating that most people either have no information about an issue or are not interested enough in an issue to form a position on it, right? So sometimes that happens, right? And that can be done. That's really important in campaigns, okay? Especially because, right, if you're going out and especially get to higher levels of running for office, right, out beyond city council, county, right, and you're doing polling to find out what issues matter to people. Why do you care about that? Because that's how you're going to frame your campaign. If people care about taxes, you're not talking about necessarily, and they don't necessarily care about climate change in a county election, right? You're going to talk about taxes, right? So if they have a non-opinion about something or they don't care enough about it, right, you're going to shift your focus. You're going to shift your campaign message. Right? All right. So political socialization, right? So when we talk about public opinion, we have to talk about where do we get our attitudes about different positions, right? And so we first start to shape how we feel about different things, different policies, institutions, you name it, about just the environment in which we live, right? We get them from the people around us, right? The people that are important to us. But this idea of political socialization is the process by which we acquire political beliefs and attitudes, right? And so we have, right, we interact with information, right? And when we talk about agents or models of political socialization, we're talking about our family, our schools, our churches, right? As you know, and as we get older, our peer groups, those we work with, right? Maybe organizations with our industry. These things start to matter, right? So they impact how we see the world, how we understand the world, how we understand government, right? And our attitudes towards government. And you probably could tell stories about how you've learned about government. And that's not necessarily just about politics, right? Because the political socialization is not just about forming an ideology. It's about your understanding of the systems too, the institutions, how the process works, right? If people that don't have a strong understanding of the structure of government and how the process works, right? There's a gap in their political socialization, okay? All right, and then we have this question of nature versus nurture, like kind of how bizarre is that, right? But scholars have been looking at, in this component of these agents of political socialization, right? Is nature a role or nurture, right? A lot of times we can see nurture plays a role, right? Because that's what we think about political socialization. Who are we listening to? Who's around? What are we learning, right? But scholars have started examining whether nature plays a role. And we're not talking about, are you born with knowledge of the US government in your DNA, or you're not born to be a liberal or a conservative or whatever it is. What scholars are talking about is there something innate in you that makes you more likely to be politically socialized or less likely to be socialized, right? If you're an extrovert, for example, and you join everything and you get involved in all this stuff, right? You're building all these networks to be politically socialized. You're involved, you're getting different opinions, right? If you're more of an introvert, that might be dialed down, right? So there's this interesting nurture versus nature debate. I don't know. It's kind of in its infancy, but it's pretty interesting. Okay. We're not going to be able to play this, but I would encourage you, because I just in the interest of time, but I'll have this link in the PowerPoints. But it's interesting. Anybody Anybody familiar with Schoolhouse Rock? Anybody? Anybody? I know I'm probably dating myself. Yes. So so this is a way in which, generations have been politically socialized, right? Well, you can follow this link, right? They did a segment on the suffrage, the suffragettes, right? The women's suffrage movement, right? And the 19th Amendment, right? So, and you can watch it, right? They have this main character who's dressed in red, white, and blue, and she's singing, and they show pictures of the women fighting for the right to vote, and then they talk about, the men who kept them from voting, and they're grouchy, black and white men. And so there's a lot of imagery there, and we learn that over time, right? Those things we've learned that this is important. It's important for women to have a say in the process, to be involved in the process, right? I mean, think about it. Is there anybody that you associate with that would think, no, I mean, women shouldn't be allowed to vote, right? Sure, they're out there, but they're very, very, very few and far between, if there are any left, right? So we've been socialized to understand that this is a good thing. Women being involved in the process is a good thing. And this is one way, right? The media plays a role and ties back to like chapter 8 and the media's role in politically socializing. All right, so measuring public opinion. Okay, so just a quick history, right? Public opinion polls go back to the 1800s, right? And over time, pollsters have tried to improve the processes, to improve sampling methods. So just to try to make sure that they get the most accurate information, right? So, right, changing with technology, right? When we deal with landlines versus cell phones and things like that, they've had to make these adjustments. But they tend to make politics more exciting, right? We talk about the polls. Everyone cites polls. How do people feel about this? But there can be drawbacks too, right? The drawbacks are, as we've seen, polls can be incorrect, and polls can maybe prevent activity that needs to be taken. But if there's not a clear path forward, maybe legislation doesn't get passed, or the right people don't get voted into office, whatever the case might be, right? So the question becomes, how does a relatively small group of interviewees tell us what tens of millions of people will do, right? That's the question. Well, it comes down to sampling techniques, right? Representative sampling, right? Where we try to approximate actual distributions in society, right? And it takes on this, so it addresses this principle of randomness, all right? So we're not going to go into all this because it's highly mathematical, right? But those a lot smarter than me have gone through and said, look, if you truly have a random sample in which you have this specific adult population and you're trying to sample it, right? Whether they be voters, men, women, whatever the case is, and it truly is random, okay, we'll talk about what random means, then you can question as little as 1,000, 1,200 people and get pretty accurate results, okay, based on mathematical formulas. And actually there are a point where there's diminishing returns. Actually, if you get 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people, you're just getting diminishing returns. You can get a pretty accurate sample with relatively small numbers of interviews, right? So what is this issue? What is this principle of randomness, and why is it so important? Well, the principle of randomness means that everything has to be random. You and I and everybody else in this adult population, whatever sample pool we're trying to target, what we're trying to understand, they have to have an equal chance of being selected for the poll, right? They have to have an equal chance of being selected, right? And that's where pollsters can get into trouble, right? If you do a landline survey, is that random? No. because how many people have landlines today? A lot less than there used to be. So you're leaving out all those people that don't have landlines. They don't have an equal chance. They have no chance of being selected for your survey, right? So pollsters have to find ways to go about making sure they have a balance between, right, landlines, cell phones, different age groups, right? Because if you just go mobile phone, guess what? What about senior citizens that are more likely, although it's less likely now, more seniors are getting cell phones all the time, but they're more likely to use the landline, and you just kind of count them out, right? So you have to be careful, right? So when these, and then quota sampling, can be used when there's difficult populations to understand, homeless populations, things like that. You can talk about where you have to target because of difficult situations, or if you want to make sure that you get an equal number roughly of men and women, you kind of have to do different tricks, but that takes away from the randomness of the sample, okay? The problems with polls, right? They're a snapshot in time, right? Things keep rolling, especially in politics and government, right? The issues keep going, they evolve. If an issue hits several news cycles, right, that issue evolves. People get more educated. They might have different opinions, right? So you have to understand that it's just a snapshot in time, and there could be sampling errors. And sampling errors could come about because for a variety of different reasons, right? You don't have the resources to pull enough people, right? And that increases. If you have 300 or 400 versus 1,000 or 1,200, right, your sampling error is going to grow. Again, these are mathematical questions, but your sampling error is going to grow, which means when we mean sampling error, the difference between the actual population and what the poll shows, okay? All right, so in one particular issue that we've seen in polling, right, and pollsters have had to work at addressing this, is overestimating likelihood of voting, right? So we'll talk about the fact that there's a lot of people that don't vote in this country. But I'm here to tell you, not just the polls show it, but as someone that's been on the ground in politics for over 20 years, I am telling you, people will lie to you about whether they're registered to vote, whether they plan to vote, whether they did vote, okay? Because why? They've been politically socialized to believe that voting is important, right? It's important to be a good citizen, right? So if someone asks them, especially someone they don't know, they answer in a way that is in line with the social norm, okay? This is kind of this is a component of, my dissertation and people complying with social norms. It's very interesting, right? How people behave. So as we continue, problems with the polls, are the poll questions, right? Are they leading questions? Are they unclear, right? What's the language used, right? What are the order of the questions, right? And then we get back to this pleasing the interviewer. What do you think the interviewer wants to hear? And then the social norms again, right? But the language is important, right? If it's complex or it's not clear, or if it's leading, right? You have to be careful, right? And there's pollsters that's what they do. Their job is to edit surveys to ensure that the language is clear and concise, not leading. The order of the questions is important, right? If I were to ask you a question, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Do you think that would be at the beginning of a poll or at the end of a poll? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Do pollsters typically ask if you're a Republican or Democrat at the beginning of a poll or end of a poll? Oh, there you go. I'm sorry. Beginning. Why say beginning, Bree? It's a good thought, right? It's what a lot of people think, right? But it's not, right? And the reason it's not put at the beginning, but I appreciate you going out there and putting that out there, Bree. The reason it's not at the beginning, which a lot of people think, right? a lot of people think, well, we're trying to identify voters, right? We want to go out and identify voters first. Are you Republican, Democrat? How do you feel about these things? And that's true. Pollsters want to identify them. But here's the problem. Pollsters have found, if I ask you if you're a Republican, one of the first questions, guess what? Pollsters, researchers have found that now that I've said that I'm a Republican, every subsequent question is influenced by that answer. Oh, do you think there should be more regulation or less regulations of guns? Oh, I better answer as a Republican. How do you feel about abortion or the southern border? I better answer like a Republican because I said I was a Republican. I better answer like I was a Republican. So those demographic types questions, party identification questions, are left to the end because the pollster is trying to trigger the most honest response without having preconceived notions or preconceived connections, right? Political connections sway your position one way or the other, okay? And then you have push polls, which aren't scientific polls at all. They're designed to push somebody to an elicit response. They're really a campaign tool to prop up a candidate or a campaign or to attack an opponent, right? You're just saying things like, yeah, if I told you that Joe Blow was a wife beater, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for him, right? That's a push pull, right? It's not meant to get an honest response. You're trying to push somebody in a certain direction and badmouth a candidate, but you're trying to use the legitimacy of the polling process to do it, all right? So a couple things here, and then we'll kind of talk about maybe if you want to take a 5-minute break, and then we can jump into chapter 7, and then maybe we can take another break and do chapter 8, but we'll talk about that in a second. So defining public opinion, right? When we talk about defining public opinion, we're talking about how does this impact, right? We talked about that at the beginning. How does this impact policy? Well, guess what, right? Politicians in the aggregate listen to the public, right? We talk about the delegate theory of representation, right? They want to know what their constituents think so that they can vote appropriately. Why? So they can win re-election or they don't get beat up in the press, whatever the case might be. So if there's support for an action that they support, they can go take that action. If there's not support for that action, they're less likely to take that action. And then here it comes, when there's non-opinion on an issue that Congress is dealing with or a legislative body is dealing with, if there's not opinion on the issue, that gives representatives some flexibility to maybe be a trustee or to vote their own way, because really they're not going to get backlash from the public because the public doesn't really have an opinion on it. So it limits government activity, absolutely does. So if it's clear, if it's not clear, that can slow down decisions. If it's really clear, it can speed up decisions, right? Oh, that's not, sorry about that. All right, and then there's some other things like opinion leaders that influence ourselves. Our representatives could be opinion leaders, interest groups could be opinion leaders, celebrities could be opinion leaders. And so there's a variety of different ways public opinion can form, okay? The media plays a role. They set the agenda. That's where we get our news. And we're also influenced by events, right? So we have life cycle effects and we have generational effects. So life cycle effects is the concept that people change as they grow older because of age-specific experiences and thus are likely to hold age-specific attitudes, right? So do I care about, how the public schools are in my neighborhood when I'm 18? No, I don't, because I'm graduating and maybe I don't have kids yet, don't care about all that stuff, right? You get in,
Maybe
you
you
start
have
a
another
family.
young relative, like I have a niece and a nephew.
Okay, so you could, right? And these aren't, and you're absolutely right. So these aren't universal, but just in general, based on your life cycle, what you're more likely to care about. But a very good point, Benjamin. So are you more likely to care about Social Security when you're 20 or when you're 45, 50, 60, 65 years old, right? It doesn't mean you can't care about Social Security now, but you're more likely to be concerned about that, right? And then we have generational effects, right? A long-lasting effect of the events of a particular time on the political opinions of those who came political age at the time, right? Those that came of age during World War II, the Vietnam War, the Great Depression. You know, we just recognized the 20 years after 9/11, right? We just hit 20 years. We remembered that fateful day. And I was right in that bracket. I was 22 when that happened. I know I'm aging myself. I don't know how many of you were even, I know there's a handful of you at least in this class that weren't born. There's just no way if you do the math, but right. So the fact that you experienced that firsthand changes you, right? People talk about JFK or the Challenger disaster, right, in the 80s, right? So these events, these are generational effects that tend to stick with you, okay? All right. So, and then some other things that the book talks about, right? People tend to shape their public opinions based on their political party or their ideology, these shortcuts, these heuristics for forming opinion. And that's why demographic information is not asked at the beginning of surveys, right? Because they know that questions trigger these heuristics when answering questions. And of course, political culture does that too, of a locality, of a state, right? These aren't universal, but political culture and the political socialization process can impact you, okay? All right, where are we at here? I don't know why these are duplicating. Anyway, all right. So let me think here. So do we want to take, we've been going, so yeah, we've
Just
been
under
going
an hour.
about an hour. So do we want to take a 5-minute break? I know I threw a lot at you. Why don't we take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and we'll jump into chapter 7. So let's look at this. I'll actually give you a couple extra minutes. So at 7:05, so that gives you 7 minutes. 7:05, we'll come back. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in a bit. All right. So now that we're back, any questions about chapter 6? Okay, so we see the important, right? We're starting to look at the political players, right? We're involved in that process. We're political players too, whether we're really interested in politics or not, or kind of somewhere in between. But we're involved in this process because we, not just at election time, but in public opinions, we convey our feelings about a particular issues or series of issues to elected officials, those making decisions. So it becomes very important to do that because elected officials do pay attention to public opinion. All right, so I am going to go ahead and share. We'll jump back in here. All right. Okay, so voting in elections, right? So again, we're talking about, public opinion, how public opinion plays a role in shaping public policy, right? Voting does too. Who we put in office, who runs for office, right? And how do we get involved in that process? That's very important. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. Okay, so we started off talking about voter registration, right? How does someone register to vote, right? Who's allowed to register? Well, every state, localities, if they have, if that state has deemed them eligible to register those to vote, but each state has a process by which someone registers to vote, and they talk about the requirements of who can vote, right? Typically, there's an age requirement, right? There is a residency requirement. There is requirements, and if we talk about residency, how long you've lived somewhere, right? A lot of times when I moved to Knoxville, couple months ago, right, if there was an election right around the corner there, and I moved too close to an election, I wouldn't be able to vote, right? And a lot of states have these type of rules. They want to make sure that somebody is a resident there, they've met, minimal qualifications. And then, we're talking about it now, right, what are other restrictions that can be put in place, right? Voter ID laws we're talking about now. Everyone has a different feeling on that. But, right, so there's different requirements that states have unsuccessfully kept on the books and successfully kept on the books, right? We've talked about that in civil rights, creating those unconstitutional laws that prevent individuals from voting based on race, ethnicity, right? We talk about suffrage and, gender. So that all matters. So we talk about felons. Can felons vote? Can felons not vote? Right? That's a component of that as well. So states make these rules.
Or certain felons only.
Or certain, right. And every state's a little bit different, right? Is it certain felons?
Like it could be like once they've been released, or it could be depending on the crime, like Florida prevents sex offenders and murderers from voting.
Absolutely, right? So every state's going to create that, right? Is it long-term? Are you just not allowed to vote while you're incarcerated or on probation? And after you've quote unquote served your time, you can go back on the voter rolls, right? Do they designate the more severe felonies for those that can no longer vote, right? So absolutely, you're absolutely right, Benjamin. So all the states make up these rules, and if you are eligible, right, then it becomes a pretty simple process, right? You talk about
just going and vote.
Going and vote.
Now, just a reminder, there are
registering.
2 states that allow felons to vote while incarcerated via absentee ballot: Maine and Vermont.
There you go. So they're all kinds, right? So, and that's going to be based on, right, where there's a lot of politics that's at play in those decisions too, right? Sometimes, right, is it about politics and which party will benefit, or is it about trying to bring criminals back into kind of the fold of the civil society, right? We can have all those sorts of debates, but yeah, so you make a great point. So right, so all these states have different criteria. We're talking about that now, right? The big battle cry now is, right, the red states are saying no, we're shoring up our process to ensure that we don't have any people that shouldn't be voting, to make sure that they don't vote, right? Those on the other side of the aisle are saying, right, these are restrictions that are they're civil rights violations, right? So we're having these debates still on whether voter ID and different restrictions violate the 14th Amendment that we've talked about, right? So we're going to continue to have these discussions, right? That's just kind of the nature of the beast, right? When you get politics involved, that's just going to happen, right? All right. So voting in the U.S., right? Not everybody votes. We know that, right? So we look at voter turnout, and voter turnout depends on a lot of different factors, but voter turnout is the percentage of citizens taking part in the election process, right? We're talking about the number of eligible voters who actually turn out on election day to cast their ballot, right? So it's important to differentiate between voting age and voting eligible populations, right? So as we've talked and Benjamin's noted, right, who's eligible, right? It could depend on the state, right? Voting age doesn't tell the whole story, because who's included in the voting age population? Anybody who's 18 or older. Are all of those individuals eligible to vote? No, they might not be citizens. They could be felons, and depending on where they live, they might not be allowed to vote. They could, if they're not registered to vote, right? They're not, if they don't register, they are not eligible to vote. So you have to take those individuals out. So based on those that are registered to vote and eligible, you look at what the voter turnout is. So remember, voting age population and voting eligible population, two very important things, right? and we've seen it change over the years of the voting age population, the turnout, right? It's come down quite a bit. Scholars have looked at if we compare voting age population in 1960 versus 2012, it's come down, but scholars have said, well, no, if you calculate for the voting eligible population, then it really hasn't seen that much of a difference, but each election is a little bit different, right? So we see, for example, and this happens at every midterm election. We're going to see that in 2022. You're going to see a downturn in the voter turnout compared to a presidential election, right? Like 2012, 2016, 2020, right? So these midterm elections, and then if you look at local elections, right, where do you think the turnout goes for local elections? In general, right down the tubes, right? I mean, I've seen turnout as low as 4, 5, 6% for local elections, and we'll talk about why that is, why turnout increases, why it doesn't increase. But every election is different, right? The characteristics of the campaign, who's running, media attention, knowledge of candidates, party affiliation, that all plays a role. Okay. So what factors influence who votes, right? Age, right? This is not, again, these are not tried and true, right? They're not saying that these aren't universal truths, right? But you're more likely to vote the older you get, right? Statistics bear that out over time, right? Why is that? Why are you more likely to vote the older you get? Anybody have a thought on that? What do you think? Let me pull up the chat here just in case. Why do you think individuals, as they get older, are more likely to vote?
The older you
Well,
are, especially
but-
if you're an adult, the more your voting actually affects your life. Because if you're 18 and you're still getting assistance from your parents and stuff, then sometimes what you're voting for doesn't really affect you. But once you get a lot older, then that actually starts to matter a lot more.
Right? So we look at that, right? We look at life cycle. Where are you at in your life cycle? Are you, right? Did you just turn 18? Are you in that 18 to 25? Are you starting to get a little bit more settled as you get to, your 25 to 30 or 35 to 45 or 50, right? You're more interested because more things are impacting you. You're more likely to buy a house, right? Or condo, buy property of some kinds, right? So you're like, where's my property tax going, right? You're getting older, right? What are they talking about my Social Security or my income tax, right? As you get more established, these things matter. And then you talk about the schools, if you have kids, and safe neighborhoods, all of that, right? So now you have more, right? You have more skin in the game, so to speak, so you care. So Sebastian, you're absolutely right. So that matters, right? So age plays a factor in that. Now, that being said, and some of you, right, who are of age might be like me. I have never missed an election since I was 18, right? Since I was old enough to vote, I have never missed an election. But I'm a big political nerd, and that's just where my interests lie, right? I'm kind of odd that way. It doesn't make you odd. It makes you interested in a variety of things, but that's not the norm, okay? Educational attainment, right? Statistics bear this out. Again, it's not universal, but the more formal education you have, the more likely you are to vote. Minority status, you see trends decreasing, right? As African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, right? You're less likely to vote than white voters, right? So there can be a variety of reasons for that, right? Political socialization plays a role, interest level, whatever the case might be, but that plays a role there. Income level, again, that's ties to kind of that socioeconomic status with educational attainment and economic interests, right? So if you make more money, there just bears out that you're more likely to vote, right? Again, more skin in the game, right? And then two-party competition, right? This is a really important one, right? Because what is two-party competition, right? We have two parties, two major parties in this country. What does two-party competition have to do with whether or not somebody votes, right? So you see this at the local level a lot. Why voter turnout drops? There's a variety of different reasons. But let's think about the state level, state legislative races, congressional races. Those are pretty high profile races, but sometimes you could have low voter turnout in a particular race because there's no competition. And maybe the individual that's running is a Democrat running in a heavily Democratic district and no Republican or other candidate runs, right? So if that happens and there's only one person on the ballot, guess what? People aren't going to be clamoring to get to the polls to vote for that individual. It doesn't matter, right? That person's going to win. And you could support that individual, but you just say that doesn't matter. You won the campaign, you won the election. So what does it matter, right? In addition to that, let's say there is a Republican on the ballot in a heavily Democratic area. The Republican doesn't really have a chance of winning, right? It's not going to necessarily drive out a lot of Republican or Democratic voters, right? If it's not competitive. Competitive races tend to drive interest, tend to drive publicity, fundraising, campaign dollars being spent, because you're trying to drive out every voter you can that will support you, right? And create that messaging to attract new voters. So two-party competition. The competition drives voter turnout. Okay. Okay. Why people don't vote? In addition to kind of that lack of two-party competition, right? There could be uninformative media coverage or no coverage, depending on the race, right? Especially at the local level, something like that. Negative campaigning, right? Polls, right? You could say, well, polls, right? You know, the polls show that this person's not going to win, so I'm just not going to vote, or my guy's a shoo-in, so why go out and vote? And then there's also something called the rational ignorance effect, right? And we might have heard this in one form or another. It's when someone purposely, they rationally decide not to vote, and we call it rational ignorance because people are saying, look, my vote's not going to make a difference, right? The representatives don't listen to me. You know, I live in I'm a Democrat, lives in a heavily Republican area, so it doesn't matter if I vote for this policy or that policy. It's never going to change anything. So, you know, I'm just going to be rationally ignorant. So because my vote doesn't make a difference, I'm just not going to educate myself on the people that are running and the issues. Okay. All right. So this goes to, we talked a little bit about political socialization and ideology. This factors in when we talk about heuristics or shortcuts for voting. How do voters make decisions? They do it based on party, right? So that is an important, that's an important component. So you could have individuals that vote a straight ticket, party line voting, right? So they say, okay, if I'm a Republican, I'm voting for all Republicans. If I'm a Democrat, I'm going to vote for all Democrats. Okay, so right, that eases, right? That you reduce the costs associated with voting that way because you don't have to research every candidate. You're just voting for the candidates in the party that you affiliate yourself with. You could be a single issue voter, right? If it's abortion, or if it's education, or if it's guns, or if it's climate, right? Immigration, whatever the case is, whatever the issue is, right? If that's your issue and that's what you care about, that's all you're going to ask. That's all you're going to care about. How does this candidate or that candidate feel about that issue, right? So they could vote based on one single issue. A lot of individuals out there that do that. Pocketbook voting, right? What about economic policy? Is this candidate or that candidate good for my pocketbook, right? Do they support policies that I think will benefit me economically, or do they support policies that will negatively impact myself and my family, right? And then there's retrospective voting, right? Looking back, right? What have you done, right? Retroactively looking, right? Retro, back. What have you done? And do I support, right? Especially these are for candidates that are running for reelection. Do I support what you've done, or do I support what the party has done? Okay, because you can tie it to the individual candidate or to a party, right? What has the party done? What has that individual done? Do I like what they've done? And do I want that to continue, right? And then you have prospective voting, which is, right, you're kind of thinking ahead, right? You're looking at somebody's track record and you're trying to evaluate, well, how will they behave in the future? And can I support them? And with that, there's always incumbency advantage. When you come back to heuristics, right, you're looking for shortcuts, right? What if you're an independent, right? Or you're independent minded, you don't really find yourself in one party or another, or you try to stay above the fray. You're looking for just, maybe you're doing it, but you want to vote for somebody based on ethics, or somebody who has experience, right? You're going to go to that incumbent, right? You recognize their name, or you had some kind of interaction with them. Incumbents have a lot of resources that they can put into a campaign. So incumbents have a significant advantage when it comes to connecting with voters and influencing voters to vote for them. All right. So deciding to run. So there's a variety of reasons candidates decide to run. But there are some basic requirements. I think we've talked about them if you want to run. So there are petitions. Does anybody know what petitions are? Has anyone ever signed a petition, seen a petition, anything like that? Okay, so petitions from a candidate's perspective is that every state has rules about how many petition signatures you need to get on the ballot, right? It's a ballot access issue. So how do you get ballot access? How do you get on the ballots? There's a petition process, right? So you have to draft up legalistic petitions as your name, your address, what you're running for, if you have a political party affiliation, all of these things. And you go around to registered voters in that state, that district, whatever the case might be, and you say you have to get so many people to sign your petition that say, okay, yeah, I okay you to be on the ballot, right? I'm saying that yes, I'm fine with you being on the ballot. It can be a certain number, it can be a certain percentage of how many people turned out in the last election, but that's a threshold issue of getting on the ballot. And then there's age restrictions, right? Typically having to be, old enough to vote. And then there's other restrictions for other offices. We know that at the federal level, and states have this too for different races, but typically at the federal level, you're looking at 25 years of age for the House, 30 years of age for the Senate, 35 years of age for president and vice president. Residency requirements, previous experience plays a role, especially if you want to appeal to voters, right? That's not a requirement to run for office, but it's a requirement, it's kind of an unwritten rule to campaign, right? Voters want to see individuals with experience. You deciding to run, whether a race is competitive or open, right? If I'm going to decide to run, do I want to run against an incumbent that's very popular? No, probably not. Might I keep my eye out and look to see if the incumbent doesn't run again and there's an open seat, what we call an open seat, no incumbent running? Then yes, that might be the time to run. So people are very strategic about when they run for office and the circumstances surrounding that. And then resources play a role. Do I have resources? Can I raise money? Who can I raise money from? How strong is my network in that regard? So those all play a factor in deciding to run, right? What are the legalistic requirements? And then what are some of these political requirements to be a successful candidate? All right. Let's see this. Okay. So if we look, right, who's seeking office? we see this on the left, gender in the general public, men and women, about 50-50 split, in the, like I said, the general population, but who's running for office more often? It's men, right? If you look at race, you have in the general public, white, Hispanic, and Black versus those seeking office, right? There's a difference there compared to the general public. And then as far as education, right? You look at the general public, we have a high school or less, some college grad, post grad, and then you look at what, who seeks elected office, right? So that matters, right? That plays a role into who's more likely to have experience, right? Or who's more likely to have resources, connections, those kind of things play a role. Any questions so far? Right. So again, right, these are the players, right? Who's deciding to get into the game and run for office? Things are changing, right? Slowly but surely, right? We see on the top of female candidates for the House of Representatives. We have, so the dark orange are the number of women running. That yellow, lighter yellowish orange, the candidates winning. So both are trending upward. More women running, more women winning in the House and the Senate as well. You have some, they kind of, it's not that clear trend, but overall you're seeing more women running and more women winning in the U.S. Senate as well. So that trend is changing over time. You see, it's a long history from 82 to 2016. All right, so we've talked about this, right? The nomination process, right? You have to get on the ballots. You have the petition process, right? Once you successfully overcome that hurdle, then you have the primary, right? You have to go through a process in which a nominee for a political party is chosen. And those things are done either by a caucus or a primary. So most people are familiar with a primary, in which you go into a primary election, you pull a Republican ballot, you see all the Republican candidates. Democratic ballot, you see the Democratic candidates, and you pick one. Or depending on the race, you might pick more than one, but each race is a little bit different. So you're going in, you're getting a ballot, you're going to a polling place, all that good stuff, things that you're just typically familiar, most people are familiar with. But there's a caucus process too. The caucus is essentially you're voting with your presence, right? You go to a party. We hear these most often when it comes to presidential elections, right? The Iowa caucus, other state caucuses. And what they are, they're political town halls, right? They organize by county and precinct. And if you're in that precinct, if you're one of the party faithful, you go to that caucus meeting, and it can be in a local gymnasium or a church or whatever the case might be. And you have the different candidates or surrogates for those candidates talk about why you should vote for them. And typically there's rules about how, when the voting starts and being able to persuade other individuals. There's usually a time limit. And then when that time goes off, when that time runs out, where you are standing signifies the candidate you support. So in a gymnasium, it could be, 4 candidates in the 4 corners of the gym. You go to one side if you support candidate A, B, C, D, and then they physically count those individual supporters, right? So it's a more involved process, right? It takes a bigger time commitment. So the difference is you typically have, like in a primary and a caucus, you have more party faithful. But you'll tend to get more involvement in a primary because the process is simpler, right? You can go, in many cases, it just take a handful, a few minutes to go in, get the ballot, vote, pop it in the machine, you're done, right? Not a lot of investment there. Okay, it does take time and effort, don't get me wrong, but not a lot of investment there. If you go to a caucus, like you are there for the duration, because if you leave, you don't get to give somebody a proxy, you don't get to just whatever, like if you're not there when people are counted, you don't count, right? So it's the really hardcore party faithful that you can count on participating in a caucus, right? And there's different primaries, top two primary, where you have the top two vote getters, regardless of party, move on to the general election. But these processes favor the two major parties because that's what people are familiar with. That's what they typically have been socialized to identify with. All right. When it comes to a lot of these, so we're going to be talking about the presidential cycle here, because you have candidates that are competing in 50 states, right? So you have the nomination. It's a grueling process, and different states have primaries on different days. But when we talk about front-loading primaries, states want to be relevant to the presidential primary process. They don't want to have their election in August when the nomination's already been sealed, right? Someone might have won the nomination in April, and then guess what? Well, their election in August doesn't really have the same excitement that it would have had if the primary was earlier. In addition, right, all of those down ballot races, you don't get the benefit of that turnout, right? That excited, the excited base of voters, getting them to turn out, because if people say, the presidential race, the nomination's already wrapped up, I'm not going to go out and vote. So those down ballot races miss out on kind of capturing that excitement from a presidential election. So states that try to front load primaries, to try to make sure they're hosting primaries when it's relevant to the presidential election cycle, right? So there's this rush to be first so that they can be relevant in the process to have involvement in picking the nominee, but also driving that excitement down ballot for those less known races. And once those nominees are chosen, you have these delegates at national conventions, the DNC, the RNC. These delegates are chosen, right, during the primary process. And those delegates and those alternate delegates, they go to the conventions, and those are the ones that vote. They vote. They're the ones. The delegates are the ones that are voting for the nominee, right? So typically in a primary process, you're not voting for the presidential candidate. You're voting for that candidate's delegates in your congressional district, so that those individuals can go represent you and vote for the nominee at the convention. All right. So again, presidential elections, right? They have to be strategic. You have resources like time and money that can be working against you. So you have to focus on where you spend your time and money. And most of that money and that time is spent in battleground states, those states that could turn the tide of an election, right? So if you are a Democrat, you're not going to spend a lot of time in New York and Illinois and California. Why? Because you're going to win those states, right? You're very likely to win those states. It would take something very significant to happen for a Republican to be competitive in those races. The Republican candidate skips those states for the very same reasons. They're not competitive. Why spend money and resources if they're not going to be competitive? So these candidates find states that they're going to be competitive in. And sometimes, like in 2016, Michigan becomes a battleground state, right? Or Pennsylvania becomes a battleground state. But you typically see, right, the Ohios, the Floridas, a handful of other states, those become these important battleground states for candidates, because that's where the Electoral College can be won or lost, right? These candidates engage in debates, right? They have a lot of ground to cover, so they have surrogates. We've seen that a lot, where you have, right? You have family members or trusted campaign supporters go out and speak on your behalf. You're trying to cover more ground, try to meet more people, generate more excitement. So debates are really important to reach a wide audience, and surrogates are used to try to expand the reach in a general election, right? All right, does anybody know how the Electoral College works. Can anybody explain it to us? What do you think? Who can explain that to us? Who wants to take a shot at it?
It's pretty much people don't directly vote for who they want, but they vote for electors who then vote for your candidate of choice.
Perfect, right? Great job. So, right, so you are voting for essentially at each state and the District of Columbia, you are voting essentially for electors, right? These electors are affiliated with a political party and the nominee of that political party, right? So so what happens is you're not voting, you don't have the electors' names on a ballot. You're voting for the candidate of your choice, right? So in the last election, Biden or Trump, right? So you're voting for that individual, right? But we don't have a national election. We have an electoral college. So the nominees are running in 51 different elections, right? They're not running in one national election. They're running in 51 different elections. So the 50 states and the District of Columbia. So as Sebastian was saying, right? So whatever in that state, let's say Florida, Illinois, Tennessee, Texas, California, whatever the popular vote is in that state, right? That nominee gets those electoral votes, right? And by that we say, okay, those votes, they get so many electors, and those electors ultimately vote on who the next president of the United States is, right? Now, how do we decide how many electors each state gets? Anybody know? So we know the number. So does anybody know the magic number to win the Electoral College? Does anybody remember? Go ahead, Benjamin.
I saw it on MSNBC back in November, the road to 270.
270, right? So where is that? So 270, why 270, right? Well, if you think about it, right, you have to look at, okay, where does that number come from? So you have to get 50% plus one, right? So, so you have to think, okay, where are these electors? How many electors does each state get? And how do you get to 270? Well, each state.
It's equivalent to
right?
the number of the House plus the Senate.
You got it, right? So going back to, right, a little bit of the conversation that you had on your, the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, how is the representation divided up between the two chambers, right? So you have your House members. Let's say in Illinois, you have 18 House members, right? And you have 2 senators, right? How many electoral votes does Illinois get? 20, right? And so on and so forth until you get to the magic 270, okay? So, but that is, so we have 435 representatives, okay? And you have 100 senators, right? So that's 535, right?
No,
The
it's
math doesn't.
438 representatives.
It is, right? So the question becomes, where do the extra 3 electors come from? So you have 535, but 535 representatives in Congress, right? House members and members of the Senate, right? But there's 538 electors. Where do those other 3 come from? Remember, the District of Columbia. So the District of Columbia doesn't get representation in Congress, right? They have delegates that provide input in Congress, but they don't vote. But they do get representation when it comes to the Electoral College. So they get 3 Electoral College votes. So take that in half, 538 divided by 2 plus 1, right? You get your 270, okay? So that's where that comes from. The framers designed this so you could have this concept of faithless electors where you say, look, this person, I know they won the popular vote in my state, but I just can't, they're just not good for the country. But states have essentially, and it's been upheld, that states can create rules to penalize or prevent faithless electors. So typically states will do that to say, no, you can't defy the will of the people. Okay. The only exceptions to universal statewide winner-take-all electoral college is Maine and Nebraska, and they have a statewide and district system in which you can win. You can split electoral college votes. So in Maine, you'll have Republicans be competitive and on some electoral votes in some districts, and Nebraska the same way for Democrats. All right, criticisms of the Electoral College. That's designed to have electors use their discretion. The candidate can become president without popular vote. Where have you heard that before, right? That's been a big battle cry saying, well, no, it should be a national popular vote. Well, remember, we are the United States, right? Think back to how important the states were, and that state sovereignty was at our founding, right? And why that's an important component of the Electoral College. So having that influence at the state level was very important, right? Most states give all electoral votes to one candidate, right? Some argue that it should be proportional, right? And if it was proportional, then there would be more battleground states. There would be more stops for candidates. They would go to, Republicans would start going to Illinois. Republicans would start going to New York and California. If they could win a certain percentage of the electoral votes, you would have Democrats spending more time in Texas and Missouri because they could win a proportion of those votes. So the fact that it's winner take all per state lends itself to some criticism. And then again, presidential campaigns focus on states that have the most electoral votes, right? So smaller states don't necessarily get the attention that they would like, right? So that also kind of there's benefits, right? To every system, there's benefits and there's negatives and positives, right? Midterm elections, right? We typically talk about the coattail effect, the reverse coattail effect. And really we're going to see, right? Does President Biden have coattails, right? Can he carry Democrats to have a successful 22 election cycle, right? Are his policies popular? Is he popular? Are they able to craft a message so that they can ride his coattails? And we'll see, okay? We'll see how that works out. All right, and then the last couple of points here, direct democracy when it comes to elections, right? We've seen that with initiatives. We've talked a little bit about that, initiatives and referendum. The benefits of that is that it's citizen driven. So instead of, if politicians aren't acting on a policy, you can create an initiative or a referendum that will get the voters to decide directly on that. Or sometimes it's, politicians support these initiatives because it takes the pressure off them and their ability to vote, gives them some cover. But it has drawbacks, right? Like voter education, right? Having to educate voters about the issue, how they should vote on the issue, what the impacts of the public policy is. So that becomes very difficult in the process, okay? All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing right here. What time is it now? All right, so I have 7:47. All right, so we have one more chapter to go. Do you want to just keep going, or do you want to take another 5-minute break? Let's do this.
Give me take another break.
Okay, so give me a thumbs up if you want to take a 5-minute break. A few there. All right, clear your screens. Well, another one there. So All right, well, I think then the thumbs up might have it. So based on that. So why don't we just go ahead, just to kind of make the last chapter a little bit easier. Why don't we go ahead? I will pause the recording. Start the recording. Here we go. We're back and we're going to finish up chapter 8. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but just think about this in terms of, right, we're talking about the political players, and we'll continue that conversation as we talk about political parties and interest groups, right? These are the political players. That's why we break them up into these units. All right, so we've talked about the public, how the public impacts elected officials and public policy. We've talked about the elected officials themselves running for office, how they go about it, the process itself, right? And then now we're going to talk about in chapter 8, the media, right? So the media is not just a way for public opinion to be conveyed or candidates to talk about the issues, right? The media plays a more substantial role than just being a conduit for these ideas being shared. And that's what we're going to talk about and the significance of the media in the political process. All right, so let me go ahead and share. All right, so the media, right? We know, right? The media is wherever we are, right? We talk about social media, we talk about broadcast media, we talk about the radio, right? We're talking about the means of communication, right? When we talk about the media, any way you can reach people widely, right? The radio, television, the news outlets, right? Social media does this, right? So you have, it collects a lot of different information. You can get a lot of different information from all of these different outlets, especially, right, social media. So like technology evolves, right? There's new ways to receive information, and typically it goes to where not only we get more information, but we get it faster and it's more convenient, right? So that's so we can see just by the breadth of the media in general, why it becomes so important when it comes to where do we get our news? How do we, what news can we trust? What information can we trust? That all plays an important role. And again, this ties back to public opinion and political socialization. What have we learned? Are you falls into the category, right? Are you the MSNBC or the CNN person, or are you the Fox News person, right? Or the Newsmax person, right? So where do you trust? What sources do you trust? Why do you trust those
You
sources?
forgot MSNBC.
Right? I thought I said MSNBC, or did I say something else?
CNN, Fox News, and Newsmax. I'm an MSNBC guy.
So yeah, MSNBC. If I didn't say that, I apologize. So depending on where you get your news, like why do you get your news there? Why is that important to you? Do you like the commentators? Do you like what they're saying, or did you grow up on it? Right. So there's a socialization process too, to where we get our news. Right? Do we go somewhere where we can kind of confirm our beliefs, or do we go somewhere where we're going to have our beliefs challenged, or we try to get a kind of a cross section of different information? That all is very important, right? So social media plays an important role in that too, because you can get information from a lot of different sources quickly, right? Now you have to decide whether or not they're credible or not. Okay. So a brief history of the media's role in the United States, right? It was before there were smartphones and TV and radio everywhere, right? Newspapers were the go-to, right? 3,000 newspapers were being published in 1860, right? A lot different today. Newspapers either died out or they've gone primarily online. And we know free press is a core principle of this country, right? That's why you have all these outlets, right? Obviously, there's other reasons, right? There's ways to make money, there's revenue, but right, the fact that there's really no limits to news outlets or media outlets is because there's that free press is at the core, is one of the core values in this country, right? So there's things that keep in mind when we're talking about the media. How are they covering the news? What are they covering, right? And we talk about this issue of managed news. And it's information that's generated and distributed by the government in such a way as to give government interest priority over candor. We see that. We talk about spin. We talk about press secretaries and how they convey different issues, and whether or not it's legitimate. Well, you have these, the goal is to have these news outlets be able to question and challenge and ask questions to say, okay, well, is this really new, and have the resource to get at accurate information, right? So it's important to be able to challenge government actors to ensure that they're acting with accountability and that they're telling the truth, right? Now, free press doesn't mean unbiased press, right? As we all know, right? So free press just means that you have the ability to go out there and report on stories or talk about issues, whatever the case might be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's unbiased, right? So we've had a long history in this country of politically sponsored newspapers and different ideological preferences within management, within different media outlets and things like that, right? So just as we look at the history, right, how things have changed, as technology has played a role. 88% of American households had a television by 1960. How does that impact, right, how you interact with your government, how you interact with candidates, how you interact with information, right? You're getting that information, you're getting it quicker, right? There's a variety of outlets, right? And that number has only grown substantially. Nearly 65% of Americans use social media networking sites today, and that means grandma and grandpa too, right? They're using it, they have their smartphones, they're using it, and more are using it every day. If you include internet users, the percentage is that 65 number, that percentage goes up to 75%. People using the internet, right? That technology to get information, access information, right? Or cat videos or whatever you want, right? But you have this technology that plays a role in how much information you get and how fast, right? Internet, cell phones, you get stories to millions, right? You access news quickly. And you can draw news from a variety of sources. Does anybody use, like I said, I'm not as familiar with all these other social media sites, these newer ones. I can kind of, be a, old man in that regard. But I mean, Facebook, like I said, I was in college when Facebook was in kind of its infancy and was starting to grow. And so I'm most familiar with Facebook, and I use that today as a news aggregator, right? I want to see what people are talking about, what news they're posting, and then I can kind of make a mental note, or right, tag something, flag whatever I want to do, and make sure I go back and read the story later if I don't have time, and do my own research on the issue, because right, the news of the day, what people are talking about on social media is usually a pretty good indicator, I found, of what the kind of flavor of the day is. What are the big issues of that day or that week or whatever of a campaign. So like I said, social media has its drawbacks because there's a lot of information you have to sort through. There's misinformation, but it can also be a benefit to bringing all that news to one place and kind of aggregating those news stories. The media provides information. That's a good thing, right? We want information. What information we're getting, is it accurate? Sometimes people can debate that issue. But they do more than that. They do more than provide information, right? They do what you call, they set the agenda, right? How do we learn about different things, right? How do we learn that, oh, something's important. Oh, we need to be upset about this, or we need to be talking about this. And then, at work, people are talking about that, right? Around as they're getting their coffee, and we're talking about that at school, and these issues come up, and, you have a instructor that posts a discussion question that's related to a contemporary issue. Well, the media is priming these issues, right? The media is deciding what to cover. Do you ever look at a media outlet and say, how are, like we talk about the Newsmax and the Fox News, do they choose to cover different stories than MSNBC and CNN? Sure, right? They could decide to cover very different topics or very different news stories, or they cover them in different ways, right? And so they're deciding what they are going to cover, and they're going to decide what to cover or how to cover it. So in agenda setting, we have these kind of two concepts of priming and framing. So priming, right? Anyone ever prime a pump, right? Or prime a well, right? You're pumping, right? You're going through the process of priming that to get kind of this information and this line of information out to the public, right? And you're getting it out there, and so that people, until it kind of takes a foothold, right? We talk about news cycles. So you're priming these issues into a news cycle, right? To tell people, somebody decided in a newsroom or a group of individuals said, look, we caught this story, we think it's important, and we want to cover it for whatever reason, and we're going to tell you about it. So they're priming an issue, right? And when we go back to public opinion, it could start off as a non-opinion. And over time, it could develop into divisive opinion, consensus opinion, based on how often it's covered, whether or not it's getting traction, right? So they prime these issues. They put these issues out in the environment, and they can cover it in such a way that it catches fire. Sometimes they die out, but you know, they're telling us what news is important, right? And they frame these issues. How do they want to frame it? Do they want to frame it as a national security issue? Do they want to frame it as a moral, ethical obligation? Think about the southern border of the U.S., right? That story can be framed in so many different ways, right? Is it a story about compassion? Is it a story about rule of law? Is it a story about COVID, right? And other diseases that are coming over the border? Is it a socioeconomic story, right? So these issues can be framed in so many ways. It's important to keep those things in mind, right? Is what they're talking about, is what these news outlets talking about, are they important? How much do they impact what our conversations are, and how do they shape public opinion? But press, like I said, when they're doing their job, it's important. They investigate wrongdoing and they report on it, right? They help hold people accountable. They can impact campaigns when they report on wrongdoing, or they can drive enough attention to create congressional hearings, to drive support for congressional hearings so that more information can come out. They socialize new generations, right? We learn about issues and about our system of government through, people that are closest to us, but also media. And like I said, I talk about Schoolhouse Rock. That's right. That's being conveyed to us through the mass media. And they provide a political forum for dialogue and debate. How do we go about solving these public policy questions? Well, we debate them, we decide them, we talk about them. And so the media provides an opportunity for us to do that. There's some theories, and you can read about this in the text, but kind of this hypodermic theory, the minimal effects theory, the cultivation theory, and it's really these theoretical ideas of how the media impacts us, right? Is it right, this straight shot, like the hypodermic needle, where we hear something and then it's like, wow, we believe it, right? We accept it, we believe it. Or is it kind of this minimal effects theory, right? We're maybe bombarded with a lot of different things, and maybe we have a lot of things going on, and we don't put a lot of faith or trust in the media. So you have this minimal effects theory for a variety of different reasons, that the media doesn't necessarily have the most substantial, most significant effect like you would see under this hypodermic theory, right? Maybe there's other larger factors like political party or political ideology that plays a more substantial role in the media. And then there's this cultivation theory that, right, it takes time, right? Over time, the media can cultivate you to think of an issue or a series of issues in a variety of different ways, or socialize you in a way to make you change your mind or focus your mind on what's important based on their coverage, their agenda setting. All right. So the government, right? So this idea, right? We kind of have to walk this line between free press and government regulation. When is government regulation necessary? So we have the FCC, right? The Federal Communication Commission, and it focuses on what we state as public airspace. So public airspace we're talking about the broadcast media, the radio stations, right? So anything going over the air is where the FCC focuses their attention. Why do they focus their attention? Is because there's different values at play here, right? So you have the value of a free press, that's important, right? But there also is the value of competition, right? Ensuring that you have competition of ideas, competition in the economy. So the fact that the public airspace is finite, right? There's only so many radio stations, frequencies at any given time, right? The fear of monopolies coming to fruition, right, is why these are regulated. One of the main reasons, but other things are that it's accessible, it's readily accessible. So regulating what can be shown, what can be heard, what you can say on public airwaves is also the role. But it focuses on the public airwaves because they are finite, but also very accessible to anybody. Okay? When it comes to ownership of, internet news outlets or cable news outlets, right? It's less of a regulation. There's less of a need for regulation because those outlets can be, theoretically infinite. Really, so there really hasn't been a very aggressive move to regulate, like I said, the cable news stations, cable outlets, internet outlets, because it's essentially there's an infinite. People that have different ideas, there's a space for you, right? You're not going to get drowned out. At least you're not going to be blocked out by finite airwaves. Okay. So you have kind of those differences between the public and the public airwaves versus kind of that private cable or internet outlets. So the media and the First Amendment, we've talked a little bit about this when it came to civil liberties, right? When it comes the limits of what can be said, right? Libel and slander, defamation. We talk about, right? It's free press doesn't mean you can say anything you want, right? People have other rights as well. You can't say, speak badly about somebody, lie about them, damage their reputation, and say, well, it's free speech, right? Freedom of the press, right? It doesn't work that way. So, right, there's a balance. But when it comes to the government, right, those are other private citizens. But when it comes to the government, right, the courts have been very, very leery of this concept of prior restraint, right? Saying the government making the case, no, this is classified. This newspaper can't print this story, whatever the case is. And the courts, for the most part, siding with the, on the First Amendment with the press saying, look, no, you would really have to have a significant government issue to prevent a media outlet from running with the story. So there are instances where that does happen, right? And it could be where there truly is, about troop movements or attacks, military actions, things like that. But as we've seen in stories like the Pentagon Papers, right, just reporting on things that would be embarrassing for government, that's not a sufficient enough reason to block it from being printed, right? And then sunshine laws, right? This idea of in sunshine laws go to this idea of, it's kind of a way, and we'll learn a little bit more about this when we talk about the bureaucracy, that members of Congress can't engage in their job of oversight by looking at every agency all the time, every year, every quarter, right? They can't do that, right? So one of the ways in which bureaucracy reforms have been implemented is through sunshine laws. So getting more eyes on the agency. So letting the media be able to come in and examine the agencies and report on it in the hopes that the more eyes that are on the agency or government entity, the more sunlight will get in, and people within those agencies will act appropriate. But if there is wrongdoing, it's more likely to be caught. And then things like the Freedom of Information Act, where there are ways to access information, and you really have to prove a substantial government interest to prevent the press and others from seeing that information. Right. All right. So with that, it's kind of a rundown of Chapter 8. Let's see where we are on time. It's 7:15. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hope that I can play this video. If this video doesn't work, maybe I can come up with something we can play at the beginning of class next week, because I think it's kind of important. It shows, let me see. All right. All right, so loading in. Yeah, I might not be able to get the audio. All right, so I see if you guys can give me, if I start this, you guys give me a thumbs up if you can hear this. Can everybody hear this? No? Hold on a second. Let me see.
It's this Monday on Fox.
How about now? All right, so let's go ahead and get this full screen. All right. All right, I'm gonna, so one more time, can you hear this? Okay, so we're gonna talk through some presidential debate moments.
And I want you to know that also, I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Who are these two guys? Anybody know? Go ahead, Benjamin.
Ronald Reagan and Mondale.
Hold on, I can't. No, I can't hear you.
Is it Ronald Reagan and Mondale?
Hold on, let me see. You get one thing to work, and then hold on. All right, can you try it again? Say something again, Benjamin.
Are those two guys Ronald Reagan and Mondale?
Why can't I hear you? Try one more thing and then. All right. So anyway, so I'm sorry that I can't hear you. So I'm going to kind of talk you through some of these sequences, and then maybe after I stop the video, I'll be able to hear you. But we'll run through this, and then I'll let you go. We're going late. But I'm sure, Benjamin, you said that even though I couldn't hear you, right? Ronald Reagan, 1984 election, Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale, right? So think about this. The media covering this debate, right? Reagan delivered this famous line, right? Because they were making fun of him. They were giving him a hard time because he was going to be the oldest president at the time. Are you fit for office? Can you do the job? And so he came back with this line at a debate. And what happened, right? He even made his opponent, do a belly laugh, right? And they caught this picture, right? This image of Mondale just laughing from his belly, right? It wasn't just a smirk, it was a substantial laugh. And right, think about this, without the television coverage of this debate, how would this event have played out? How would this image have played, right? If it didn't exist, right? Would this have played as well if people didn't physically see it on TV? So the fact that he was able to make his opponent laugh showed, right, how kind of virile he was, right? That he had these chops, right? That he's called a great communicator, and that, he's fit for office. Kind of people think that Mondale lost the race that night, right? It was just, he wasn't going to win there. All right, so let's go to the next one.
Governor Reagan again, typically, is against such a proposal. Governor, there you go again.
That's not the best one, but it just kind of shows the humor kind of winning out and kind of that smirk and how he was able to communicate by seeing it on TV.
Admiral Stockdale, your opening statement, please, sir.
Who am I? Why am I here?
Yeah, I don't know if you ever remember that one, and we won't linger on that, but that was Ross Perot's running mate. Kind of one of those things where he was being made fun of too for not being kind of aware and just kind of making a joke of it. Here's an important one.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime.
So what's going on there, right? That's 1988, George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. So Michael Dukakis is being asked a question about his wife being raped, murdered, right? And would you support the death penalty for that? And how did he respond? He responded, well, no, just very calmly. No, I won't do that because of this or that or the reasons, right? Trying to approach this rationally, right? The premise of the question was, well, that's your wife, right? Why wouldn't you be more angry about it? He was very stoic and answered it just very generically in line with his previous campaign positions. But think about that. People saw how he responded in that moment. And people were like, God, what a cold SOB he was. But the media brought that to life, brought that into people's homes to see that, right?
A question right here.
Yes, how has
Right there. George H.W. Bush checking his watch in the 1992 election, right? There's Ross Perot, there's Bill Clinton, right? What does that say? What if that wasn't caught on TV, right? There was a same little uproar with Biden supposedly checking his watch recently, right? When those service members who were killed were brought home, right? What does that signify? What if that wasn't caught on camera? Does that have the same impact? No, people talk about, oh, we checked his watch, but well, what was the context? People saw that in their homes and they said, oh my God, this guy just doesn't want to be here.
national debt personally affected each of your lives?
I think the national debt affects everybody. Obviously, it has a lot to do with interest rates. It has.
She's saying you personally.
He's talking about, H.W. Bush is talking about interest rates and talking about these things, right? Kind of talking in these big economic public policy terms. The question was, how is the economy, downturn in the economy impacted you, right? Him not being able to talk, right, to the man on the street, just in general terms, connecting with the audience and that being caught on camera matters. It influences how people are perceived.
Basis, how has it affected you?
Has it affected you personally?
He can't answer the question.
I love my grandchildren. I want to think that
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
Absolutely devastating line, right? Doesn't have the same impact if you read it in the paper or listen to it on the radio, or watching the facial expressions, watching how he delivered that line. Flawless, right? And absolutely leveled Dan Quayle.
Critics are raving about Fox's new
Catching an ad here.
There's this dance reality show. I'm going to audition. Life is about coming back from a punch. You gotta keep
Bear
going.
with me.
These people, their lives turned upside down.
Alan, yes. Is the show going to be a hit? Alan, yes. See that? Alan, no. The Big Leap, Monday on Fox.
All right, hopefully won't get another one.
That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can.
So right there, and then another laugh by Gore, but also, right, that was in the 2000 election, right, where there was talk, right? These campaigns, they strategized, they planned. George Bush knew he didn't have the same stature, right? Al Gore's campaign was telling him, yeah, walk over to them, let them see the stature. You're bigger than him, right? Show that kind of exudes more power, more authority, right? But in that particular case, George W. Bush was ready for it, right? And got that chuckle, even got his opponent to laugh by looking him down, saying, what are you doing here? I'm talking, right? So kind of that kind of backfired on Al Gore. Just a couple more
He
minutes
said
here.
in the Rose Garden, the day after the attack, it was an act of terror. It was not a spontaneous demonstration. Is that what you're saying?
Please proceed.
That was perfect response, right? So you could tell Mitt Romney was trying to get a response, right? Was trying to get a response, get a rise out of then President Barack Obama, right? But because they planned and they strategized about how to go, they knew it was going to come up in the debate. So Obama's response was, okay, continue, finish your thought. And look what happens to Romney.
I want to make sure we get that for the record, because it took the president 14 days before he called the attack in Benghazi an act of terror.
Get the transcript.
He was caught off guard, right? Because he expected a back and forth between him and Obama. That didn't happen, right? So he's flustered, and it was kind of humming, and that was all caught on camera, right? People saw that. That matters.
He did, in fact, sir. So let me call it an act of
Can you
terror.
say that a little louder, Candy?
He did call it an act of terror.
I'm glad that you recognize that Al Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia.
And this is just funny now because it seems like all we talk about is
The
Russia.
1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back, because the Cold War has been over for 20 years.
All right. All right, so I will just wrap that up by saying, if you look at the importance of the media in capturing those moments that can have a big impact on how we perceive individuals, campaigns, that you can see how powerful the media can be in swaying that public debates and campaigns. So it's, yeah, 8:29. I won't hold you back any longer. I'll let you out just a minute early. So I'm going to go ahead and stop. But great job tonight. I
Bye,
know it was a
guys.
long night. We had a lot to cover. So I'm